Еще раз добрый день. Мы начинаем вторую часть первого дня. Меня зовут Александр Скидан. Я редактор отдела практика журнала «Новое литературное обозрение». Буду модерировать эту вторую нашу секцию. В ней 4 доклада. Секция называется «Мемориализация травмы в повседневных практиках и популярной культуре». И открывает ее Джером из Манчестерского университета Великобритании, который прочтет свой доклад по-английски. Соответственно, после его доклада можно задавать вопросы, желательно по-английски. Если кому-то это не с руки, неудобно, мы будем переводить. Доклад называется «Память и травма» в англофонном историческом фильме «Несколько свежих примеров». Please, Джером. Go on.
Hello, спасибо. It's my only word of Russian. I apologize for speaking in English. And I also apologize for speaking very quickly. I tend to talk very fast, so I will try and speak slowly. If I speak too fast, if I start getting excited and start getting really, really quick, then tell me. Please put your hand up and slow me down. I was asked to talk about memory and trauma, and I'm going to do this by looking at some historical film from the last 10 years. And these films are anglophone films. These are American and English movies. They're films that are in the English language. In some ways, they're films that speak to a national identity. They're produced by national industries. But in some ways, they also speak to a global identity. And one of the things that came out of this morning's discussion, I think, was an idea of how trauma changes subjectivity. And I'm very interested in how that works across different cultures, and particularly with regard to historical events. The only real great historical event I'm going to talk about briefly is 9/11, which I think might be considered a global traumatic event. I'm not sure that the Holocaust actually is a global traumatic event, or has the same meaning across the world. 9/11 doesn't have the same meaning across the world. But I think we need to think about how film, particularly, can negotiate international audiences and specifically national audiences. Okay, am I going too fast, or too slow, or just about okay? It's fine. Okay, this is fine. Good. So, memory and trauma in Anglophone historical film. And this is a paper, a talk, about the negotiation of memory and trauma in some movies. It's about strategies for dealing with trauma, for engaging with trauma, for understanding trauma, and in some ways for ignoring it. We've heard about effacement already. There's a great deal of effacement that goes on in American film particularly. I'm quite interested in thinking about what that means. Key, I think, as we've already heard, is a problem of representation and a crisis of subjectivity. This has been discussed previously. I'm not going to rehearse the arguments, particularly the very in-depth theoretical arguments here, but just to think that this builds on, I hope, what we have heard already today, particularly around the idea of representation, how we deal with traumatic events, how we make them into fiction, and the ethical problems with making something into a form of entertainment that itself is an incredibly traumatic event. I'm going to start, though, by thinking about the division between the past and history. Because to my mind, the historical film negotiates this division. This is Sander Cohen. You may have heard of him. He's quite controversial. He's an interesting writer. He is an American academic who denounces the history establishment. He calls himself an ex-historian. Because he sees history as a discipline, as enacting violence upon the subject, and particularly as a sort of state-sponsored instrument of particular ways of thinking and being. And he says this, and you will recognise this as postmodern historiography effectively. History must be radically severed from the past. The former is always calibrated with cultural contradictions, whereas the latter is much more fluid and notion. Past is involved with both active and involuntary memory. but history can only project the simulation of the remembered. And I'm going to argue today that historical film works in this way. Historical film is a simulation of the remembered, but it works to negotiate between past and history. It sits in the fulcrum, in the same way that historical writing does. I'll outline some of the key things that I'm going to deal with. I'm effectively going to look at some films and see how they respond to trauma, how they present trauma, and particularly with these ideas in mind. Shame, disgrace, dishonour, guilt, retribution, triumph, ghosts and hauntings, and I'll talk about ethics as well. Is everyone comfortable with those ideas? Yeah, we're all right with this? I mean, not comfortable. You know what they are, you recognise them. It's often the case that the historian is considered to be a detective, and vice versa. Often the detective is considered to be an historian. This quote behind me comes from a novel by Ian Rankin, who is a crime writer. And this is about his central character investigating crime. And he says, "It was the work that did it. As a detective, he lived in people's pasts, crimes committed before he arrived on the scene. Witnesses ransacked. He'd become a historian, and the role had bled into his personal life. Ghosts, bad dreams, echoes." And I love the idea that a historian is someone who engages with this violence, this horror, these ghosts, these echoes, and it's something which makes him not sleep. It's something which upsets us in the past as both historians and as citizens of the world. The past is violent, it's inherently criminal, you might argue, in this reading. And I'm interested in talking about it. It's a fun thing to talk about on Friday, right? We're all enjoying it. Jem Kurtzaya, the South African writer, is very interested in this process, about how the past has an iteration in the present. And evidently, any writer from a nation that has had an incredibly violent recent history would be interested in this. But I think that Kurtzaya is incredibly engaged with the way in which the past changes contemporary life. This is a moment when the main character's daughter has been raped, and the violence of the past is enacted on her in her present. It's a horrific bodily moment. She says this, Kurtzaya says this, she does not reply. She would rather hide her face, and he knows why. Because of the disgrace, because of the shame. That is what their visitors have achieved, that is what they've done to this confident modern young woman. Like a stain, the story is spreading across the district. Not her own story to spread, but theirs. They are its owners. How they put her in her place, how they showed her what a woman was for. And this is a kind of anti-historical moment in some ways. This is the end of the future in this book. She no longer has a future, Lucy, this character. She is stopped. And I think that one of the things that's going on in some of the texts I'm looking at today is this end of a future. It's a sort of an engagement with a kind of very proleptic modernity. So that's a very unpleasant way of putting it. It's an end, a stop, an end of history that's being enacted somehow. And this is it, this kind of violent iteration. Similarly, I want to talk about what Roth argues in The Plot Against America, Philip Roth, the American novelist. Toward the end, and this is one of the greatest kind of expressions to my mind of how historical fictions can distress the present, and they can demonstrate this distress. The Plot Against America is a novel in which Charles Lindbergh wins the election instead of Roosevelt in 1941, so the Americans never entered the war. As Lindbergh's election couldn't have made clearer to me, the unfolding of the unforeseen was everything. Turned the wrong way round, the relentless unforeseen was what we school children studied as history. Harmless history, where everything unexpected in its own time is chronicled on the page as inevitable. The terror of the unforeseen is what the science of history hides, turning a disaster into an epic. So for this character in The Plot Against America, history is chaos. History is violence, history is horrific and terrifying, something to be escaped. And what the practice of history does is translate that into something which is literary, into an epic, which is a literary genre. You get this creation. And so I'm interested in how that doesn't work, actually. I'm interested in how historical fiction, particularly film, sometimes can allow us to see the joins, the ruptures, the fragments, which we've already heard about so much this morning. Not necessarily consciously. I'm not necessarily saying this is something which is a strategy of these filmmakers, although it is for some. but that we can use film to reflect upon the consequences of trauma. So the central idea I'm going to begin with, I'm going to sort of be playing with, is that all past is violently traumatic to the present, in the way that Goff argued, and in some ways in the way that XXI argued. It's something that we need to remember very carefully, and to translate very carefully. Our ethical position to the past, when we represent it, is incredibly complex, and we have to be very careful. And my interest is in how historical fictions approach traumatic events, how they present memory, and how they reconcile the two. And they often don't. They often are really problematic. I always say that sometimes, as on your right, historical films sometimes engage in a process of forgetting. You might argue that historical film is about effacing memory and just turning it into mere costumery, turning it into just entertainment. This is very problematic, we might argue. Do they have a responsibility, these fictions? They are, after all, just entertainment. And what are the ethical positions that we as audience members or filmmakers have to take in order to do this? This is a great quote from one of the great contemporary English novelists, Hilary Mantel. If you haven't read her, I urge you to read her. She's a fabulous writer. And she talks about, again, this idea that history is horrific. A relation of past events brings you up against events and mentalities that, should you choose to describe them, would bring you to the borders of what your readers could bear. The danger you have to negotiate is not the coyness of the past, it is its obscenity. So as a practitioner, what Mantel says is, when you write about the past, you are translating it from something obscene into something comprehensible. And that is a very interventionist thing to do, she argues. I'm not just making this up. Films are obsessed with trauma. Contemporary historical films are obsessed with trauma. This is a still from A Dangerous Method, which is a film about Jung and Freud, and which dramatized the idea that bad things happen in your past and they make you act in particular ways in the present. That is a very glib way of doing Freudian and Jungian analysis, but for my money, that's what this film does. The idea of a return of a repressed memory. And the return of a repressed memory is something which is to be sought. We want to remember the repressed. Or in fact, the process of psychoanalysis is about remembering the repressed. Or at least dealing with the post-traumatic events. Or I don't mean trauma in the way that we heard earlier. So there's a metatextual event. It's not just that this is happening at the level of my analysis. I think film, particularly American film, is obsessed with events happening in the past, conditioning the present. And this is because they are reflecting a particularly kind of pop Freudian version of contemporary social psychodrama. I'm going to go through my examples now, and then I'll kind of come to a little conclusion. So shame, particularly demonstrated. Particularly. Excuse me. Right, particularly demonstrated by urban alienation of the film This Is England. In This Is England, the shame of the central characters in this movie is closely associated with their marginalisation because of Thatcherite neoliberal politics. They are violently put to the edges of society. They are repressed themselves, they repress their own traumas, and actually that erupts in violence. In the first film, This Is England, it erupts in racist violence, and in the subsequent television series, it erupts in violence toward the family, domestic violence. So Shane Meadows, who's a great English filmmaker, is interested in the physical toll that horrific political decisions can have on the individual, and then how that is enacted in their present, so how past decisions can be enacted in their present. And I think this film is obsessed with the idea of shame, that we look back on events and they fill us full of horror and shame and distress and anxiety. And this, in his film, leads us to a sort of political isolation as a consequence, as you can see here. And the film is full of the characters next to large urban wastelands, so they are clearly seen as isolated. And this figures for me their shame, the sadness of them. And shame in an incredibly politicised way. If you think about the shame that the character in Kozea's book will feel, this is political shame. as a consequence of traumatic violent events. Disgrace is another great idea that we might explore as a consequence of traumatic issues. The Master, which came out last year, is a film which is about American celebrity, really. And what it's interested in doing is demonstrating that American celebrity is built on lies and fiction. And it's a film which is obsessed with the idea that a particular modern American identity is built on untruth and lying. So there's an idea in this film of sort of a central disgrace to contemporary American identity. That it can't be ideal, it can't be clean, it has to be somehow embodying this disgraced moment. I hope you all know the films of Michael Haneke, who is obsessed himself with repression. In Caché, his film Caché, the repression of the memory of violence which is enacted upon the Algerians. In The White Ribbon, which this is a still from, the idea of repressing actual feelings which then may come out in the future. These are German children at the turn of the century, last century. So there's a sense in this movie that they are repressing their feelings in order to give vent to them about 35 years later. Haneke also is a filmmaker who's obsessed with forgetting. His most recent movie, And More, is about Alzheimer's disease. And so the great kind of Western trope of forgetting and the fear of forgetting that he is articulating in that movie. Am I going too fast or am I going too slow? And I don't mean words-wise, I mean intellectually. Okay? This one? I know. Other consequences of violent trauma, we might think about guilt. We might think about how films might articulate or work through ideas of guilt. Ken Loach made films about... Oh, no, sorry. Where did he come from? Sorry, Dishonour. Yeah, I'm getting on to guilt in a second. Dishonour. This is a movie about a hunger strike in 1981 of Bobby Sands and his death as a consequence. And again, much as in Shame, the political violence is enacted upon the body, and this is seen in this movie to be incredibly dishonourable. This is a moment in which we might see a traumatic memory creating dishonour in the present and a distress in the present. Ken Loach works on guilt. Ken Loach is obsessed with the idea of guilt and accusation. And he's very unusual amongst Western filmmakers of being politically accusatory. This is a film about Northern Ireland, or Ireland actually, and this is a film about the Spanish Civil War. He's the only filmmaker, to my mind, who is engaged with the violence that was undertaken on the behalf of the British state in Ireland. And so these are accusatory films. They work through their models of guilt by pointing their finger. But there are also films like this. This is Shutter Island, which are about survivor guilt. This is a hallucinatory image that one of the characters sees, which he's meant to be Jew from, he liberated one of the camps, and so he has these flashbacks, and he has this survivor guilt. But there is no, to my mind, guilt about this in American cinema. The number of US films that are actually about guilt seem to me to be few and far between. If you can name more than 2 films about slavery from the last 20 years, major films, I will be interested. Of course, there is this film, which is a film about slavery. You may not have seen this. This is Django Unchained, which came out last year, which is a film about slavery, but it's also a film about retribution. So we might then pass from guilt in terms of our reactions to trauma and think about retribution. How do we respond to traumatic events and to distress, etc.? But one of the ways we might respond to distress is retribution. We might wish to take vengeance. Or we might think about triumph. We might feel that actually the traumatic events of the past mean that we are in some way in a good position. And we might look to the revivification of the Western genre over the last 10 years, and a kind of ambiguous triumph that is articulated in the West. A sense of individuality, but a kind of key problem. We might think about contemporary movies that are actually about triumph coming out of traumatic events. This is Lincoln, a film which basically argues that you have to kill some people in order to get a state that is symmetrical and stable. And the violence at some points is okay. So this film, through its discourse of triumph, is about trying to say, we are okay now because of the violence then, and so therefore the traumatic events of the past should just be left. And then of course there's this movie, Zero Dark 30, which is obsessed again with going back to the past, events of the past, in order to very much aggressively express an American identity that is now made whole again. The trauma of 9/11 is somehow effaced by this movie, you might want. And you can see the reflection, the American flag, her contentment. This still, I think, is about a peace which has been attained because this traumatic event somehow is over. 3 minutes. Wow, easily enough. So those are some stages that we might look at in American and English film to think about the ways in which trauma, violence, these things are remembered, the way in which they crop up, the way in which they figure or arrive in these films. They're also articulated, as I said, metatextually in various ways. In terms of the return of the repressed, is a key trope in the last 10 years in American and English film, sorry, our key trope has been child abuse. And the idea of the return of a repressed violence in the present is shot, crime film is shot through with it. Most contemporary film, you might argue, has an echo of this. So the idea of child abuse as a kind of central trope, I think, is about figuring trauma and then how that works in the present, as I already argued. Historical fictions, I think, are obsessed with ghosts and with hauntings. With the return, the intervention of the fictional past into the actual present. These films, therefore, are obsessed with being haunted, with being later, with having ghosts involved in them, and working ways through that. Why? Well, one idea might be because they are responding to an end of history. This is as Derrida is kind of critiquing, but that these movies somehow are seeing a lack of something. A lack of ideology, a lack of God, I don't know, but in some way they are trying to work through this here. Something that doesn't belong to knowledge any longer. We heard a little bit about this earlier, we can talk about that in questions. So, these traumatic events, or all of the history as a traumatic event, has led to a kind of forgetting or a kind of dislocation of category, which leads to this kind of traumatic response. It's not just in historical film, and I'm going to conclude very briefly with this. These are, we got nice, not very nice, sorry, you just had your lunch as well. In American film particularly, American TV and English TV, the zombie is the central trope of the last 5 years. Why is this? Well, there's an uncanny resemblance to the present, there's the return of the dead, there's something which is living which should not be living. And for me, our fascination with this return, something which should not be there, figures this kind of cultural obsession with trauma and it coming back and trying to kill you. And what does it go for? A zombie goes for your brains. It goes for the thing that gives you subjectivity, you might argue. Anyway, we can talk about that. So I think that this obsession with zombies is a kind of reflects a wider cultural concern with things coming back that are painful and difficult and that should stay dead. Yeah? However, this is Downton Abbey. I've talked about this quite a lot with various people this week. You may or may not know this. I have given you some very quick examples of moments where trauma, pain, political violence might erupt, or might be seen to have erupted in these movies. But most historical TV, most historical film, is actually interested in alleviating that, in smoothing out that difference. So despite the fact that Downton Abbey begins with the sinking of the Titanic, which might be argued to be the key traumatic event of the 20th century in some way, it soon moves on from there and is interested in making us feel comfortable and happy with the past. This past is not dangerous. And I'm interested in why that is, how we can have the dangerous past and the comfortable past in the same place. So some quick finishing words. How do we escape from the trauma of history? I don't know, I'm not going to answer that. But more, how do filmmakers and novelists and TV makers enable us to think about how we might do this? How do we represent the violence of this past? And what are the ethical implications of this? this. And I started by asking these questions. I don't think I have any answers, but hopefully what I've done is demonstrate that film is at least grappling with some of these questions, consciously or unconsciously. And we can see in these movies new ways that we might explore these ideas. History, Steven said, is a nightmare from which I'm trying to awake. This is in Joyce's Ulysses. And he is talking about the way that history creates him as an Irishman, I think. I'm not saying that I know what Joyce thought at this point. What I'm trying to argue here is that these movies are trying to deal with this nightmare and trying to work out ways of reacting and responding to this nightmare. And I'm going to finish with this from Kurt Zayev. This is from his book, Diary of a Bad Year. I was going to say that when you live in shameful times, shame descends upon everyone, and you have simply to bear it. It is your lot and your punishment. And to my mind, these movies, on the one hand, seek to demonstrate that this is our punishment, but also try to find out ways of alleviating that punishment intellectually, affectively, and conceptually. Thank you very much for this.
I had, I guess, one tiny little comment about the slavery movies. Amistad and The Color Purple.
The Color Purple.
I mean, the moment for slavery came in the 90s with those two films. And Amistad was supposed to be like the huge one as well. And it's like it just failed because it was Spielberg's.
Sorry, forgive me, wait. Color Purple is it in the 90s? Or is it,
No, it's even 1988 or something.
That's what maybe I'm being a bit clear, but yeah, The Color Purple, they're both by Spielberg as well, right? So they're both Spielberg movies, right?
Yeah, it's all Spielberg.
And if you then put Lincoln on top of that, I mean, there's a whole.
It's all part of his, history project.
But so if we took Spielberg out of the picture, there's no one. I mean, my point is that there's.
But Spielberg is everyone. I mean, if you look at his filmography, it's like.
Don't forget about Russian speaking audience.
All right, I'll go slower. But that was just a side comment. And I wanted to say, actually, it seems to me that the trauma which is missing from American film is actually the genocide of Aboriginal peoples in the United States. I mean, that one is really missing, where slavery does come up. But actually had real more theoretical questions, which might actually be comments, I'm not sure. The question is really, when you turn the entirety of the past into a scene of trauma, it seems to me that you're putting yourself and historians into an entirely untenable ethical position with regard to actually delineating where trauma begins and ends, finding an analytical language which can discriminate between the massive collective violence and its consequences, Holocaust, and the everyday trauma of neoliberalism, or the everyday trauma of the typical zombie who reappears, who is just a normal person, right? It seems to me that there's a kind of a major ethical problem here in the totalization of theoretical discourse about trauma and history, which we have to deal with sometime in the next 2 days, and I'd be interested in your reactions on that. And I just wanted to comment briefly on the discussion of futurity. It's sort of a light bulb went off in my head when you were talking about futurity. I was talking with Misha Yampolsky in the break about this question of why trauma as the major theoretical term beginning in the late 80s and going into the 90s. And I think one might postulate, right, that there's a tight relationship between the absolute loss of futurity as a dimension of political discourse and historical discourse following the end of the Cold War, and the obsession with the incomprehensibility of pasts as sites of trauma in this same period.
Certainly. Okay, so the first question was about American slavery movies. You're right, Color Purple is a major American movie about slavery, considering slavery, and Amistad, which is where that still was from. Similarly, Amistad is 1993, I think, or thereabouts. There were several movies also on the anniversary of the abolition of slavery in 2008. And so it's not to say that there aren't, but when they are major event movies saying we are doing this, and that is very important. It's not really in the kind of general background of films, in the way that the Holocaust actually is in the general background of quite a lot of historical films, and rarely mentioned, to the point that actually, as the first paper was talking about today, it becomes a kind of sign which you don't really even have to refer to. Whereas slavery doesn't, and I don't understand why that is. You're right, the reclamation of Aboriginal genocide is incredibly more problematic. I watched a movie this week about Australian Aboriginal experience, and that again doesn't really exist very much. So these things are forgotten about. I'm from the UK, we forget about the 19th century. We just ignore it basically. And most of what was done under imperial rule. It's just not there. Ken Loach, who I showed you, is the only person who is dealing with that. Your two theoretical questions, I agree with you about the second, really. Yeah, I think that this is why we are so obsessed with trauma, basically. And the second, yeah, I am being very glib. I know I'm talking very fast about a lot of big ideas. I would never say that necessarily that it's all one thing and that we can not differentiate between different types. To my mind, the incomprehensibility of the past has to enact some kind of violence on the present. Whether that violence is homogenous, I don't think it is. But what these people are doing is negotiating that somehow. And I think that's fascinating to watch. And they are negotiating their own ethical positions, and we as scholars are negotiating our own ethical positions. So you're in a very kind of complex web of meaning, which to my mind no one really has started unthinking, and whether we need to or not, I don't know. But hopefully we can start to think. But also how we do that internationally as well. My experience over the last couple of days has been amazing because I'm seeing things from a completely different perspective. I'm an anglophone scholar, I look to all the states, and looking this way is amazing. I'm hearing what people think.
My question actually follows on the question that was put just a moment ago. I was wondering if trauma, if for you the past is by definition traumatic. Is any past traumatic? Is that what you're trying to say?
That's
my first question. So, in which case, it would mean that you use trauma as a kind of unifying metaphor, and which of course requires a redefinition of trauma if it's the case. And then just another brief question on the films that you showed us. Don't you think that those are ways of thematizing or representing violence in cinema rather than alluding to trauma? Like just a way of representing various forms of violence as they are, kind of formulated by means of cinematic works. Thanks.
View is that the past is other, the past is strange, and one way we might think about that otherness is to think about it in terms of trauma, or as a traumatic set, or as a kind of traumatic event. But we need to think about then how we translate that past into the present in my examples, things that I'm concerned with. And we have to be very careful of that, how we translate that from one to another. You're right, I'm looking just at films that thematize violence, but that's because it's easier to do that with the things I'm doing. I think you could happily look at, and I have looked at, other texts which think about the past in this way and are distressed by the past. The key kind of difference in my work would be how texts represent religious difference across historical time. And that's incredible. That's what the obscenity that Hilary Mantel is talking about. She's not really talking about violence. She's talking about ways of thinking that are so other. Particularly, she's thinking about kind of 16th century models that we cannot comprehend them or hope to comprehend them. But we are still engaged in an attempt at reading them or translating them or understanding them somehow, and that itself enacts this central problem. Does that make sense?
Present yourself.
Birgit Menzel from Germany. Actually, my question is exactly also was the one of Helena Petrovska asked, but I still want to specify the question. It is the question about the aesthetics of violence. You talk about movies, you dealt with these movies in terms of thematic and plot and narrative, but the aesthetics of violence, I think, is an essential issue that should be addressed, and maybe I like your classification you gave, but maybe it would be fruitful to address or to incorporate in which way violence is aesthetically represented, because on the one hand, in an entertainment movie as such, the genre of movie is entertaining, it it should capture the people, fascinate. I think it can be, for instance, illustrated, illustrate like Recht, and thereby morally accuse the violence, or it can perform, maybe like, let's say, Saroki, and paralyze sometimes people, you know, and this is important for the issue of trauma, or it can maybe illustrate, perform, or it can just portray violence. I think there are at least 3 or 4 ways to aesthetically represent violence, and I think it will be important to address this within your classification. That's my suggestion.
No, Sam, the 2 movies that I showed you that are the most problematic for me are Django Unchained and Hunger. Hunger because it is so hyper-real and realistic and so affective to watch that its violence, I think, puts all of these questions to the audience. It says, why are you watching? And how does the experience of watching this work? Django Unchained, I spoke about this with some students on Tuesday, is linguistically violent to its audience. It uses words that the audience cannot hope to deal with to create historical difference and a jag of historical difference. So that's not, the violence of the film is one thing, but actually the linguistic violence of hearing people described in such terms is horrific, I think. But I think, yeah, in terms of this problem of representation that has been discussed already, whether, actually it's interesting, I might revoke what I said earlier, maybe it's key that the violent moments are the moments where this comes back. Because there are no other ways of dealing possibly with these issues. That actually you have to go to the violence. But yeah, I think you need to think about varying ways that this works. Another movie that I wanted to mention here is, do you know Shame, which came out? It was Steve McQueen, who made Hunger, made a film called Shame, which is much more interesting in some ways and much less interesting in other ways, about sex addiction. And the character in that is to my mind, is enacting the neoliberal horror of his society through his sex addiction. But it's suggested at the end that it's because of something that happened in his past. So the film is about trauma, of 2 types of trauma and 2 types of violence. And so that's not a film that has any violence in it whatsoever, but reminds us of all kinds of violences